Hello, I am Marilyn, and I'm an alcoholic. And I am thrilled to be here. Thank you, Neil, and anybody else who is involved in invitations. And I certainly thank Amy for that kind introduction and for being so hospitable. I'm actually staying with Amy now. And I certainly thank Meg, and Meg picked me up at the Salt Lake City airport and drove all the way the long distance to Provo. And I thank many of her friends and sponsees for being here, and my sponsee Tivoli that came all the way from Park City. And goodness, it's good to see everybody. This program has kept me sober for quite a while. My sobriety date is February 8th, 1972. And so that attests to great power in this program. Alcoholism seems to follow a pattern, and we all seem to have to get to a point of hopelessness before we give ourselves over to this simple program. And Dr. Carl Jung recognized that when he was trying to treat Roland Hazard, and he said, you know, you're a hopeless case. And don't hold out any hope for you unless you could have a spiritual experience. And I've been trying to produce that in you, but just hasn't worked, so I'm sorry. And while he was with Dr. Jung, he stayed sober, but when he left, he went through Paris, and somebody said, would you like a drink? And he said, I don't mind if I do. And that started it all again. And so he was back with the good doctor when he heard that dreadful news. And I got to that state of hopelessness. My hopelessness came when I was pretty much living in my garage. There was a family inside of the house, little children and my husband and grandmas that had come to take care of them. And I was kind of like that, well, you know, sometimes a possum will wander into the backyard. You might even feed it, but just don't come in the house, you know that. But I drank in the garage, and as I sat there, I just wondered how did it happen? I mean, I had all my life up till a certain point wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a great scientist. I wanted to win the Nobel Prize. I wanted to have scientists as friends, and I was off to a good start. I went off to a good school. I married a scientist, non-alcoholic scientist, so he was pursuing his career, and I was drinking in the garage. And I was a graduate student working on a biochemistry project, and I had a wonderful director. I had support. It was what everybody needs to have the start of an academic career. And yet, somehow, there was something that was even more fascinating than science, and it was right on the shelf in the laboratory. It was 90% ethanol. Yeah, that's a 180 proof drink, and quite good. And there was a little bit of a problem. There was a federal seal because the government supplied this stuff. I mean, it was practically free for research purposes. But the federal seal said not to be used except for research purposes. Well, this was the 60s. And we were doing, well, we looked at the problem of research. How does this affect the human personality? And we just drank and really did intense research on that problem. And then we'd go out to bars at night, of course. And what was happening was that the director would come by, and he would say, how's your work going? And I would say, oh, just fine, thank you. Need any help? Oh, no. And so this went on for quite a while. It was a big lab, many people, and apparently he believed me. Until one day he said, how is it going? And I said, great, just great. And he said, well, that's good news. I want you to tell the lab about it, give a lab report next week, and begin to write this up, because we've got to think about publishing your work. Well, I mean, I had some lab books, and I opened them, and there were some drawings of the lab mice, a limerick or two. There was a young man from Nantucket. It just didn't seem like the substance of a lab report. And now, my coping skills were not too good. I didn't know what to do, but I just sort of thought, this is the kiss of death. And I just went home and mailed the keys back sometime later. And alcohol had been such a good friend. It had given me such a good time. The friends, the bars, swimming at midnight in the sea, fun. And now it had all come to an end. And now it was a different kind of friend. It was a friend in despair, just getting through the day, one day after the other. And then finally, I got sick, and I just knew that I had some exotic disease, and went to the doctor. He did some tests and came out, and he said, I have some good news. And I thought, good news? I feel so terrible. What is the good news? I was very confused, just deep confusion. He said, you are pregnant. And I just blurted out, oh my gosh, I wonder if it's mine. And it was. And there were others, and that's when the grandma started moving in. My husband was terrified because I'd go out driving with a little child in the car. That was the late 60s now. And so he just quickly brought his mother in, or my mother would come, and I'm kind of moved to the garage. And there I was in this state of hopelessness. And the hopelessness for me was just going to sleep or being in a blackout and coming to it sometime and thinking, you know, this is getting bad. I'm not going to drink tomorrow. And then the next day would come, and I would sit in the garage in despair and think, maybe just a few drinks, just to feel better. And that went on. During that time, I noticed that there were many, many ants coming into the garage. And I puzzled over that. Now, my favorite drink at that time was beer, and I would buy many cases. And there was a refrigerator out there, so it was perfect. Now, beer is that all-purpose drink. You don't have to drink anything else because there's so much liquid in it. And you don't have to eat anything else because there's so much sugar in it. And I was living on beer, and apparently the ants were too, because there is that movie Airplane where somebody had a drinking problem, and many times they'd miss their face. And I had that problem. And so the beer would spill on the floor of the garage and evaporate, leaving behind all these sugars. And the ants, party time for the ants, and they'd come in. And I'd study these little fellows. And they came in, they had friends, they had jobs, they had a sense of purpose. Simple creatures, and I had missed it entirely. And the real hopelessness came, though, when I was coming to, and no longer did I think, I'm not going to drink tomorrow. My thought was, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I am going to drink tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and I'm going to die of alcoholism, and I'll probably take others down with me. There's no hope. Well, I'm sober here right now. Now, how did that happen? Well, I called LA Central Office, not to get help at all, but I did that now and then because I was desperately lonely. I had no friends except the ants, and I am kind to them now. They stood by me, and but the other thing that was a little bit of relief from that loneliness was Central Office, because there were humans there and they would talk to me. Not long, because they'd always ask do you have a drinking problem? And then once I said no, they would want to get off the phone. They like to help alcoholics, they said. And I said, you need to talk to me. I'm so lonely. Please talk to me. And they'd stay on the phone maybe a little while longer. And I would scream, don't go, please don't go. But then they would go. Well, I was calling out of deep and terrible loneliness in 1972, in February. And a person answered the phone, and I said, please talk to me. I'm all alone. I need somebody to talk to. And she said, okay, we can talk. And then the question, do you have a drinking problem? And of course I said no. And she didn't say anything because I added, please just stay on the phone and talk to me. And she said, well, we'll talk. And we talked for a while. And then she asked, how much do you drink? And I said, oh, I don't drink. I just want you to talk to me. Please, don't go, please. I want you to talk to me. So we talked a while. And then she said, did you have a drink today? And I said, I gotta go now. And she said, don't go. Well, she got my address. And she said, I'm just going to have somebody come by and talk to you. You want someone? This person will talk to you. She's a talker. She'll come and talk to you. So I agreed to that. And Lorena came. Lorena is sober in Ojai, 50-some years sober, still being of service. Pretty amazing. And so Lorena came to my house, and she told me her story. And it was so sad. I think I had tears coming down my cheeks. I mean, she got into terrible problems with alcohol, and I felt sorry for her. But then she got real happy and talked about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she said that she would like to take me to a meeting, and I said, oh, no, I'm not that kind of person. I don't go to meetings. And she said, yes, and what she said was, I don't like to go alone. I really would love, I would go to a meeting, she said, if you would come with me. I don't like to show up alone, and we'd have a good time, and you'd be such a help to me. Well, I mean, wanting to help her out, I mean, I just thought, okay, we'll go. And so we went to this dark, quiet meeting, and she got me up in the front row. And after the break, the main speaker was announced, somebody named Marion. And Marion told my story. And for the first time, I identified with another person. I heard my story. She talked about unhealthy dependence on her husband. And I realized that I was fully dependent on these adults in my life. My mother, my mother-in-law, my husband. I'd lost the ability to do just about everything except to go out to the store and buy more to drink. And totally helpless and fiercely dependent. She talked about fear, and I had so much. I was afraid of sunshine. I thought it was coming in to poison us all. And so after the meeting ended, I ran up and I kind of attached in my unhealthy way to her, sort of tick-like. I would just wait for warm mammals to come along. I'd attach and drain out their lives. I'd been doing that with my husband for years. But she would just flick me off her side and say, go talk to a newcomer. She began to sponsor me. She did lead me into this great big group in West Los Angeles, the Pacific Group. And it had a leader and founder, Clancy I, whom maybe some of you know or met. He did a lot of traveling and speaking. And this group was highly structured, a lot of discipline, and we all had things that we did. And they were just basically that triangle, Unity Recovery Service. Come to meetings every night, 7 meetings a week. My glasses always fall down. It's not a tick. I really can't see. Not a different kind of tick. But go to 7 meetings a week. Take a job at every meeting. Make it be your own. Talk to other people. And then we have the recovery part, the steps. And at first, I was just going to meetings. People were telling stories to one another. What is this about? I mean, this is not therapy. This is not anything I'd seen in the university. It's just nameless and formless. And what does it mean? It's a program of recovery. There's nothing to it, I thought. Well, the leader of our group, Clancy, now and then, yes. The leader of our group, Clancy, would tell a story about the invisible boat. And he said that Alcoholics Anonymous is like the invisible boat. You come out on the dock and you hear somebody say, "Get in the boat," and you look and there's water, but there's no boat, and there's voices, but no person, but somebody saying, "Get in the boat, it's right here, right in front of you, step into the boat." No, there's nothing there. Step in the boat, get in the boat. All right, I'm going to sink in the water, but I'll step. And you realize that there's something solid. Now sit down, and you sit and there's a seat, but you don't see anything. And then the voice says, "Start rowing." Well, there's no oars. Yes, here, grab this. And I could feel something solid. Now row. So I started rowing. Row, just row. And as you're rowing, the boat becomes visible. And I could see people in front of me, and they were all rowing. Kept rowing. This is pretty amazing. The boat materializes. Well, it's so amazing and interesting, I could just stop rowing. And as I stop rowing, the boat becomes invisible again. That was what I was in. So I jumped in. As I was participating in this fellowship, I began to see the unity of it. I began to see the purpose of it. I began to see that we are getting well. I began to see the influence of a higher power. The boat became visible for me. In that first year, there was a thing that happened at home that kind of was maybe a mini spiritual awakening. Anyway, it was something that opened my eyes. And it was around Christmas time. My sobriety date is February 8th, but I was kind of really coming to in February. And there was a Christmas tree and 3 little children, and by that time I figured out they were mine. There were presents. My mother was there, and the 2 daughters and our son opened the presents, and we're just so happy. And the little girls were playing with their dolls and games, and our little son David opened his 20 presents, I think a lot of presents because Grandma was there, and then burst into tears. And my mother said, "David, why are you so sad?" And he said, "Because I didn't get just what I always wanted." And my mother said, "What is that, David?" And he said, "I don't know. I just know I didn't get it." Wow, I thought, that is the story of my life. There were so many things that I thought, if I would just get that next step, then I'd finally be a happy person. And the ultimate that was there, if I could just be a scientist, then I'd be a happy person. And I got into a lab, I had a research project, I wasn't happy. I had taken all of those things with me that make a life miserable. Things like, I don't like you, but I want you to like me a whole lot. I'm going to tell you a whole lot of lies because I hate myself so much and I want you to believe all of them. Things like deep, deep and hideous envy for anybody who seemed to have just what I always wanted and I wasn't getting it. We later call those things character defects. I had burned a lot of people. I was so cruel to my mother, my mother-in-law, just totally crazy to my husband. And an absentee mom at best, all of that. So with that kind of baggage, of course I had to be unhappy. Of course. But what do you do with that? Now here I was in Alcoholics Anonymous, feeling bad, not getting just what I always wanted. And hearing David and realizing, I wonder if that could change. It did change, but it's a very slow process. What happens when we take the steps, I believe, is that we begin to look outward. I think our first 6 steps are kind of focused inward, where I certainly was totally focused on myself. You don't like me. You're talking about me behind my back. How can I get just what I always wanted? All of these thoughts. And then once we write an inventory, read it to somebody else, face up to step 6, then everything changes. We're told that, okay, you're a mess, but there's probably nothing you can do about it. Well, then there's step 7 that begins to talk about a higher power. Now, I came into this program as an atheist. I had no belief in anything spiritual. I thought there's reason on one hand, that's science, and then there's the supernatural. And I associated the supernatural with the Easter Bunny and Count Dracula, and I come into this program, believe in things like that. That's going to save you. Well, I thank God I was in a structured group, so for a long time, my sponsor was my higher power. The group was my higher power. But now, coming up against this, realizing that I am just a total mess, what am I going to do about that? And then saying that I then begin to turn this over to a higher power. And that, I think, is the point at which we begin to look outward, looking to something beyond self, and asking for a little bit of help. Well, I thought I'll give it a go. Now, another thing that was happening at that time was that there was a great speaker, the great Chuck C. And he's the one who inspired, or actually a retreat he gave was a new pair of glasses that some of you have probably read. And he was doing a lot of speaking in West Los Angeles. He was the sponsor of Clancy. So we saw him, and he knew some great big thing. And I just thought, I'd love to know what he knows. And yet, that just seemed so impossible. But he'd walk into a room, and the whole room would light up. There was a radiance about him. So one day, I just said into outer space, if you're there, I'd like to get to know you. And if you're really there, I'm willing to go on any path you pick for me. That was the way I took the 3rd step, really. But you see, the transformation had already occurred because I could never have made that prayer unless I had been transformed. In the past, I would have said, if you're there, I've got a big agenda for you. I mean, you must be Santa Claus, so here's the list. But just to say, I'll go on any path you pick for me, said that brain was just now kind of catching up with heart. And so I made that prayer, and nothing happened. I just had sincerely said, I want experience, I want to know you. And so I did assume that a chariot would come out of the sky, and loud music. I mean, I've seen movies, Charlton Heston, and I mean, that's what happens. But it didn't. Nothing happened for a while, except in that year, there were a lot of emotional displacements and rearrangements. Carl Jung talked about that, saying that that was what was necessary for Roland Hazard, deep emotional displacements and rearrangements, old concepts swept away, new ones replacing them. And that's what I think our steps do for us. That's why it is a program of recovery, because together we go through these steps, and this transformation occurs, and we become different people. And different to the extent that I could go back into the world and pass for normal. Somewhere, as a result of these steps, the veil parted, and I came into contact with a higher power, God of my very own. And for me, it was the experience of, You've been there all along, haven't you? I mean, I just saw one coincidence after another, getting the perfect sponsor, being taken to that meeting and finding somebody just right for me, events coming into place, one coincidence after another for recovery. And so I had come to believe. It was kind of sudden where everything opened up. And so I'd go to newcomers and tell them about this. I mean, it's really true. There is a higher power. And their eyes would kind of glaze over and they'd try to get away in a hurry. And then I'd go to old timers and they'd just say, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Okay. Well, it was exciting for me. And that was about the time that I went back into the world, went back to school, went back to work, and things were going well. I began to sponsor people. I had one sponsee, and she was an art historian, but not at first. She had been a social worker, and she just realized that that was a noble profession, but not for her. She had always wanted to do art history. So I said, well, just why don't you go study that? Well, she went to a university, and it was made so easy for her. And I said to her, don't you see how God is working in your life, these coincidences? And she agreed. And she finished a big degree, a PhD in art history. And then right away got accepted for the thing that every academic wants, a postdoc, a postdoctoral fellowship. Don't you see how God is working in your life? And then she'd come to Los Angeles, and she was my own private art historian. We'd go to museums, and life was so beautiful, God working in my life. And then the creme de la creme, she was offered a tenure track position in a university, the goal of every academic. And then she had a pain in her side. And I said, go to the doctor. And she went to the doctor, and it was diagnosed as stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And I couldn't say, see how God is working in your life? It was a crisis of faith for me. And there's this, my friend, I have a friend, Diana, she's a Buddhist, and she tells me this thing, it's a saying, when you find the Buddha on the road, kill him. And I thought Buddhism was a peaceful religion. I mean, what is this? She says, well, it's a metaphor. You don't really kill the Buddha, but it's just when you think that you know what God is all about, your idea will probably be smashed to earth. Just forget about it. If you think you know God, you really don't. God is very big, very complex, and we have to just assume that whatever understanding we have is probably less than the real thing. And every now and then something shakes it all up, as it did for me. And I've gone through that kind of thing several times in sobriety, where the Buddha disappears. And I have to find a whole new relationship, a whole new experience of my higher power. The way that I found at that time was actually my daughter, who said, remember when we were young, Dad used to read us stories. I couldn't because I was always drunk, but Bill would read stories to them. Remember he read Winnie the Pooh, and Winnie the Pooh one time said to Piglet, Piglet said to Winnie the Pooh, what is your favorite thing to do? And Winnie the Pooh said, eating honey. And then he thought a moment, and he said, no, it's that moment before eating honey. And Susie said, think of Sally. She had that moment before eating honey. My daughter is actually an academic. She's a professor. And she said that she had that moment, and it was delicious indeed. Then she went to work, and now she has 1 million students complaining about their grades, and faculty meetings where everybody's fighting with one another, and one thing, a hideous thing after another. So Sally had the best of both worlds. She had that moment before eating honey, before moving on to that next step. And somehow that was that picture I needed. And faith was restored, and higher power came back into my life, but far more complex. As time goes by, it's ever more distant, but ever more real. There was a time in sobriety where I just thought, Marianne moved away. I don't have a sponsor. I'm depending on my best friend. Life's kind of gray. I'm getting away from the program. And luckily, a story that Clancy told came to mind. And he talked about a great big ship in the harbor. And ships pull into dock, and then sailors throw out these ropes, the moorings, and they get tied to the dock, and the ship stays there. And let's say there's some devious fellow that comes out every night with a big chainsaw and saws through a mooring. And amazingly, nothing happens. I mean, you just cut through one and nothing happens at all. And then you can come the next night, and he would come with his chainsaw and cut through another one, and nothing happened at all. And then another night, and cut another mooring, and nothing happened. And then one day he came and cut through a mooring, and the great big ship just sailed out into the harbor. And I realized that I'd been cutting out some things. Now, what is important in my sobriety? Which is the mooring that really keeps me in the dock, keeps me sober? I don't know. So as time goes by, I really don't drop any of them. But at that time, I was lightening up on meetings, concentrating on work, participating in fewer activities, sponsoring fewer people, cutting the moorings one by one. And luckily, my friends were able to point that out to me. And I went back to my home group, the Pacific group, and the leader of that group, Clancy, became my sponsor. And he was super active, and he just set an example that I couldn't match ever. So it was always good. My character defects, of course, come back. We take 6 and 7. They're gone for a while, but under stress or inaction, they creep back, and I began to tell lies. But my favorite is sloth. And so it's always good to have a sponsor that does a lot more than I do. I mean, I called one night and I said, I've got to go to Lake Arrowhead. That's out of Los Angeles, across town, Friday night in traffic and up a mountain to speak. I mean, how can they ask for such a thing? And Clancy said, yeah, I know, it's tough, isn't it? I'd like to listen to your complaints, but I've got to catch a plane for Newfoundland. I'm doing a bunch of workshops up there. So that was always how it was. And so I was kind of forced by embarrassment to step up my program, and I have been active pretty much ever since. And the one thing that it's done, it just brought me a lot of joy. It brought me much, much closer to the program. And life got very, very good. I was making amends, and there's just nothing like making amends to make you feel better, except it feels worse at the time. One of the early ones was the director of that lab. I went to see him. It took a while. I made an appointment, but he didn't see me for a couple of months. Not sure why. He might have remembered who I was. But I finally went in to see him, and I told him what we say. I've learned that I am an alcoholic. I started drinking in the lab. I was an alcoholic then, and I squandered a wonderful opportunity you gave me. I broke a lot of glassware. I blew up some stuff. I'd like to offer some financial help to students, if that would be possible. What can I do to make this right? And he just looked at me with like a look of terror. I think he thought I'm asking to come back to work. And he got up and put his hand on the door handle, which I took as a sign, like go through the door and leave, which I did. And I called, my sponsor wasn't available, I got an old timer. And she said, that's the apology. That's just the first step. You're going to have to make living amends on this one. And I was in the fellowship, and I just wondered if I'll ever go to work again. I mean, resume, drank in garage, talked to the ants. I mean, so when I was about 4 years sober or so, we'd moved up to San Francisco, and I got a call, and it was from the director of that lab, and he was offering me a job in maybe a moment of insanity. He said, would you like to come back to work? We have something we'd like for you to do. And so I got to go back there and make amends at the scene of the crime. And there were people left over from the old days, and one of them, Tom, said, I remember you. I remember that Christmas party when we threw you into the centrifuge. And yeah, I remember some of those parties. Goodness. But I just found that even in sobriety, I'm not very good in laboratory science. I continue to break stuff, and so I just went into a whole different field of information work using computers where everybody's safe, and so that's been good. And in these later years, I've taught science, actually in a lifelong learning institute, which has been great fun, because these are professionals or anybody who has retired and wants to come in and learn something they don't know anything about, like plumbers might want to read the works of Shakespeare, for example. And so I teach science to attorneys and plumbers and people who don't know anything about science, so I can always keep ahead of them, and so that's been fun for me. But the gift is that somehow through this process is that I just don't see a difference between faith on the one hand and science on the other. In fact, I taught a watered-down cosmology course about black holes and the size of the universe and infinities and all of that. So mystical, and that just represents higher power and the magnitude of higher power and what we're dealing with. And then I taught a course in immunology, the complexity of the immune system, how it can fight off and recognize something that's going to hurt us and kill that and not kill ourselves. I mean, how can that be? The complexity of life. I'm growing broccoli in my backyard from a tiny seed. And this one tiny seed just a few days ago had turned into a bowl of broccoli. Amazing. And so I see higher power in that. And so I don't see a separation now. And that truly, that's definitely a gift of Alcoholics Anonymous. When I was 40 years sober, life was so good. Our 2 daughters were producing grandchildren. All 3 kids had gotten wonderful jobs and doing well. And I just kind of had a boring story, but I'm getting old. I'm running out the clock. Life is good. Goodbye. And people would just yawn. But that's sobriety. Sorry. To disappoint you newcomers, I'm not as miserable as you. I know you wish I were, but... Well, with that kind of thing going for me, I went to the State Line Convention, which is a once-a-year thing in Las Vegas, and it's just an intense workshop series of talks, one after the other, on steps, sponsorship, home group, all kinds of AA topics. And I was talking Friday night and telling about the wonderful family and how everything was going so well in my life, and got down from the podium, and there were frantic phone calls. They couldn't find David, our son. He didn't come home from work. His young wife was worried. 2 sisters were worried. Where was David? We didn't know. And by midnight, well, by about 11 o'clock that night, police had gone into his office and found that he had hanged himself in his office. We'll never know. He did not leave a note. He seemed to have a good life. He was an elite athlete, a wonderful profession, beautiful young wife, a little stepson he had bonded with. Had all of those things that you would think would make life worthwhile. We often talk, Bill, my husband, Susie, Becky, David's sisters, We remember little David, we used to tease him about the Christmas tree. Never did get just what he didn't know what it was. Maybe he had my emotions, but he didn't drink. Alcohol treated him like his dad, no effect at all. So he had no relief if he had that set of emotions that I had, getting to that place in life and realizing, no, that's not it either. Maybe David never did get just what he always wanted and had to seek it beyond. We'll never know. Well, I thought my life has come to an end. There's nothing up ahead. That is the worst thing that I could imagine. I couldn't even follow a news story about something like that. The loss of a child at any age is almost unbearable, but to suicide, as I said, I couldn't imagine going on. But I had a strong sponsor, that was Clancy, and I called him, and he could be gruff, and I woke him up, and he said, "What do you want?" I was asleep. And then he was like the old Clark Kent Superman movies. Clark Kent would step into the phone booth, take off the outer clothing, and Superman. So Clancy had a way of doing that. He would just be slumped over in a chair, and he'd be called up to the podium, and then he would give this fantastic talk. And that night, I just heard him go into the phone booth, and outer clothing, probably pajamas, and underneath, sponsor. And he had that sponsor voice and said, "You have a program. You're sober for 40 years. You go home and take care of your husband because he does not have a program. And your whole family's going to need you. Now you'll have a couple of years of hard grief, but you'll get through it because you have the program, and there will be plenty of support, and there will be people who have had similar experiences." And he said, "Get in the car and drive home, comfort your husband." And so around midnight I got into the car because it was a hypnotic suggestion. I believe in strong sponsorship. And I heard those words and started across the desert. It's about a 5-hour drive. And for the first part, I had one CD to listen to, and that was the great Sandy B., who passed away a few years ago, whom we all loved so much. He had lost his 2 daughters the year before. And I'd seen him at my meeting, my home group, and I knew he was okay. And I got his CD, and that was the one I had. And he said, on the CD, "I hope that something like that does not happen to you, but if it does, I'm going to tell you what I did, what you should do. You go out to your higher power and you form that bond as never before and say, 'I won't leave you, please don't leave me.' And then when you do begin to react heavily, guess who comes back with you?" And so I practiced that in the car, over and over. Talk to my higher power, "Please don't leave me. Give me strength to get home. Give me words to say to Bill." And made it home. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was able to call my friend of all those years. We've been sober together for now 51 years. And she was in New York, so I could call her. And she knew David when he was just a little fellow. We all grew up together. And once she understood what was happening, she said, "I'm just going to talk to you." And she talked me all the way back into Los Angeles. And so I went in the house, still on the phone with my friend, "Help me," because I didn't know what state Bill would be in. I could hear him on the phone. He kept calling, and he was shattered, and he was just doubled up, just a shell of himself. His son, his beloved son, was gone. And so the beginning of a whole new era of getting through the unbearable. But Clancy was absolutely right. There were people in the fellowship. My friend Diana's sponsee, Julie, had lost her son 10 years before, and we'd gone that together with that, with her for that terrible experience, and she was right there. So there were all of these people that said, "Step into this circle, it is safe." Julie also said, if you can accept this, you will find that there will be blessings in your life. And I thought, easy for you to say. Well, I could see that there were blessings in her life, and she had lost her 18-year-old son in a car accident. The first blessing, I think, was just survival and seeing the family survived. And we began to listen to one another more carefully. And the second was a kind of resilience for later losses. Nothing that bad could ever happen again. And I have had losses after that, but there is a kind of resilience, a trust that it will be fine. It will be fine. And yet there was just something about thinking that, what's up ahead? Well, I was elected president of this institute where I was teaching, and that was a wonderful distraction, just another coincidence at just the right time. And then back into full activity and Alcoholics Anonymous, knowing that something had happened to me that was so terrible it's never happened to anybody else, until I began to speak in Alcoholics Anonymous again, and always somebody would come through the line with a similar story. And I began to realize that tragedy strikes all of us, sometimes in a different form. But luckily, we have this program. And then, as years went by, 5 years ago, Bill crossed over to the other side, and he had come to believe. He was a scientist. And because of what happened to me, he had had a glimmer of what was happening. And as he was dying, he was on hospice care, people from the other side came to visit him. Now, I don't know what that was about, but it was very convincing to him. And he said, I'll wait for you on the other side. And I kind of believe that's true. And then my sponsor of 30 years passed away. And I thought, well, I'm old, I'm nearly 50 years sober, and how can I find another sponsor? Well, I was at a retreat given by Father Tom W. in Oakland, and he does a lot of retreats. And I've always been a follower of him and his sponsor, Father Terry, who was a priest in Los Angeles, and a good friend and spiritual mentor. And he was at this retreat, and he said, just out of the blue, he said, I'll sponsor anyone. They usually don't call, but I'll sponsor them. And I thought, this is my chance. I mean, I've always admired him. And so afterwards I asked if he would be my sponsor. Well, he had to say yes. He said, I'll sponsor anyone. And so, and being a priest, I think he has to be true to his word, right? And so he's been my sponsor for about 4 years now, and that has been a wonderful relationship. I've had 3 great sponsors, and they were each perfect for me at that time in my sobriety. How the universe, one more time, has a way of guiding me into recovery. All I have to do is just say yes to it, and it's usually pretty obvious, like that was. At that time, when Clancy passed away, kind of the matriarch of our group passed away too, and it left a lot of orphans. And I began to sponsor a lot of people that I hadn't sponsored before, just to take up the slack. And some of them are very active. One likes to travel, so I've gone on some trips with her, and one was to Egypt. And I found myself going to Egypt. Here, Grandma was going to Egypt. I rode a camel, and that was fun. We went in pyramids, and gosh, that was exciting. You go up a lot of steps and down steps and hieroglyphics and sarcophagi and oh my gosh, sometimes passages where you get down on your hands and knees and crawl through. And I was going through with another couple, and we were traveling together, and they didn't seem to be having as much fun as I was. They seemed to be a little worried. And I thought, this is safe, we're okay, don't worry. Well, finally they confessed why they were worrying, and they said, well, you're so old, and we think you're going to have a heart attack and die, and how will we get you out of here? So I thought about that, and that was a problem for them. But then I realized, I said, just think of where we are. This is a pyramid. It's basically a tomb. What better place? Just leave me here. And then they got happy too, and we all got out. And So that's been exciting. And just when I thought, one more time, when life has truly ended, all the fun is over, a whole new world of sobriety opens up with new adventures. The latest is that my grandson, one of my grandsons, Adam, he graduated from college, didn't know what he was going to do with his life, wanted to take a few years. So I got a call from him, and he said, "Grandma, I got a job in downtown LA. Could I move in with you?" And I said, "Yes, Adam, I would love that." So Adam moved in, and gosh, he is so much fun. And it's wonderful to have him there. He's at home right now taking care of the cat while I'm here in Utah. And just a delight, and clever and funny. And I had always thought that there would be David in my old age, and that was not to be, and that was a big gap in my heart. But now there is Adam who has moved in, who is such a joy, such a joy. He's not David, he's Adam, he's very much Adam, the light of my life. And all of it came from just saying yes to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's that thought these days of finally getting just what I always wanted. And I can't even quite tell you what it is, but I just know that I got it, all because of you. Thank you.